So sometimes I'll be reading an economics article or there's something on the news, and everyone's entitled to an opinion. But sometimes it's just not worth entertaining someone's opinion. Like there's something so blatantly wrong in an article, and you just feel like someone's just not qualified to talk about economics or something similar. And this can apply to a lot of areas, and it can be very useful just to have a filter where you just know it's not worth reading something. And I've noticed that on the news especially, the people talking about economics in the news, they're more, they come more from a politics background, and their arguments are more persuasive rather than having any substance to it. And so I suppose what I want to talk about right now is one particular thing that I've noticed in some economics or news articles. That's a quick way of filtering out whether they have any idea what they're talking about. And this is in the area of inflation and deflation. And I think this is a good filter because these two words are used very often. And so if we quickly notice that the usage of these words is bonkers, then we can filter out wasting our time reading an article. So I suppose there's three different uses for the term inflation. And I guess the core of what I want to talk about today is how these three uses are conflated. And it just shows that the person writing the article has absolutely no background in the area of economics. And okay, so let's get into it. So of course there is two distinct definitions of the word inflation that are commonly used, and they're two completely different definitions. And anyone who is into economics will be aware of the differences. So the first term, when we use inflation, we're referring to the inflation of the monetary supply, or the expansion of the monetary supply. And then the second use of inflation is the loss of purchasing power with respect, and I want to make that very clear, with respect to a particular reference point, a particular graph, a particular index that you want to look at. And then I want to throw in a kind of a third definition as well, which sometimes I feel like it's not necessary. So the third one is a change in any of the first two definitions of inflation. And usually this is not strictly necessary because we just know in context whether we're talking about the change in something or not. So I suppose a common analogy would be for time. When we say time, we don't really make it explicit whether we're talking about absolute time or delta time, a change in time, relative time. We just use the same term interchangeably because it's just obvious from context. But I suppose sometimes people might struggle with that context, so maybe it might be suitable to clarify this third definition. And there's actually one case where we do seem to have two different terms, and this is in physics. Now, I'm not an expert in physics, so you can correct me if I'm wrong here. But when we're talking about momentum, a change or an instantaneous adjustment to momentum is called impulse. So if we take the derivative of momentum, that's called force. And then if we integrate that again, so the unit for that would be Newton seconds, then that is called impulse. But then when we multiply newtons by seconds, it just becomes the same unit as momentum already is. So we're just integrating back down. So it's the exact same thing. So momentum and impulse use the same unit. It means the same thing, but impulse is a change to momentum. It's a delta. But I don't think we really use a different term for other things very often. So acceleration, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a corresponding term for a change in acceleration. We would just say a change or a delta. So it's the same thing really for inflation and deflation. And it seems to come up, this confusion seems to come up very often because it's been the case in my own conversations about inflation and deflation with people. Sometimes we'll make the argument that something causes inflation or causes deflation. And the response I get back is, no, this certainly does not cause deflation, because deflation, where we see some inflation going on here relative to the consumer price index, but clearly this thing doesn't cause deflation. And I never said it caused absolute deflation. And usually when we're talking about cause and effect, a change in one thing causes a change in another thing. We're talking about the difference relative to what it would have been. I mean, it's very rare when we make arguments, when we make claims about things, that we're not talking about the change in something. It's very rare that we're talking about an absolute effect. This is going to cause an absolute level of deflation relative to the consumer price index. And I feel like it's such common sense when you are making a claim about that. But I guess sometimes people, when they hear inflation and deflation, they just pick up this absolute viewpoint relative to the consumer price index. So anyway, that's one thing to look out for if you're reading an article and somehow they conflate an absolute level of inflation and deflation with a relative amount, because I've seen this so frequently, and you just see it and you just look at it and you just go, that you just see this person has absolutely no background and they're not able to make any basic critical thinking skills, where they end up conflating the two, and they start, using justification for their decision based on whatever. They'll reference something and it's referring to the other one. And it's so clearly obvious that it's referring to the other one. It's so clear that we're talking about the relative change and not the absolute, or the other way around. And it's just something you can notice so quickly when reading. But yet, it's so commonplace, and the average person just doesn't seem to notice it. But anyway, and then going back to the first two definitions, which is the expansion of the monetary supply or the loss of purchasing power. As well, people seem to conflate those two very often. And, definitionally they are distinct. Of course, you're very welcome to have an opinion that there's some connection between them or some correlation between them or something like that. You might have the opinion that a change in monetary supply, so monetary inflation, is going to perhaps cause a loss of purchasing power. That's a very valid opinion you could have, and you're welcome to make that opinion, but you can't just insist that the two forms of inflation are the same. From a definitional point of view, they're completely different, and you're welcome to make that argument. You can state that argument in whatever your article is, but to just immediately conflate the two without even mentioning that is crazy, to be honest. And of course, in my opinion, of course, they're absolutely not the same thing in any way. Like, if you had a sudden increase in the monetary supply, or a sudden decrease in the monetary supply, so we had some sudden monetary deflation, either of them is going to cause a sudden shock in the economy. The economy will likely run a little bit less efficiently, and we'll lose a little bit of value in the economy, whatever way you want to measure value. And that's going to cause either it's going to show up as a loss of purchasing power, or it could show up as a reduction in typical wages for the amount of work and effort people put in. But there's a good chance it will show up in the form of a loss of purchasing power. So it's very likely that a sudden deflation of the monetary supply that the economy is not expecting, that could absolutely cause inflation relative to the CPI. So a loss of purchasing power. But you don't have to agree with my opinion on that. But the most important thing is that people have different opinions about the connection there between the two different definitions of inflation, and many articles just outright conflate the two. They just assume the definition for both of them are the same. They start mixing the arguments It's hard taking an argument about one of them and then applying it to the other. And they don't even know, if you search up on Google or whatever, the definition for inflation, they're not even aware that there's two different definitions. So yeah. And then as I said, the third one, which is a change in any of the first two definitions. Again, people seem to love looking at the absolute value. So I think a common argument is like, oh, deflation is bad for the economy. And sometimes I'll make the argument that, oh, there's times where deflation can be good for the economy. And I'll say like, oh, something might cause a deflationary force, and it might be good or whatever. And then they'll come back and say, no, there's no deflation there. What are you talking about? And they're looking at deflation relative to the consumer price index. And then they're making the claim that, no, the deflation relative to the CPI, this is what's bad for the economy. And they're so focused on this reference point of the CPI, and their arguments is entirely around that. And it's like, oh, suddenly deflation relative to the CPI, this is bad for the economy. It's going to cause the economy to stagnate. And it's like, am I not allowed to have an argument about the relative a deflationary force? We might still have net inflation relative to whatever index you're interested in. We might have net deflation. I don't care what your index is. I'm just talking about things relatively. If we have a change in inflation, or an inflationary change, or a deflationary change, an inflationary deflationary force, whatever you want to call it, and what effect does that have? And from a mathematics point of view, using a reference point anyway is very dodgy, because if you use a fixed reference point, like suddenly deflation relative to this reference point would be considered bad for the economy. That's so arbitrary, because if you picked a different reference point, suddenly that argument doesn't hold up. So you're making a claim based on a specific reference point. So you're making the decision that other reference points this claim doesn't apply to, and that you found a golden reference point where your claim applies to. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means your argument is maybe a little bit less mathematical or generally applicable. You're going to need a lot more like evidence to back that up. It's going to be, I suppose, there's going to be a lot more of an empirical argument, a much more scientific argument as opposed to a theoretical argument, which is absolutely fine, but you just need to be aware of that. You need to be aware that you've made a decision to use a specific reference point, and you're making a claim about the absolute level of inflation or deflation as opposed to a relative change. And usually I'm more interested in the theoretical version. Like, I like imagining if I simulated an economy in a game, and who cares whether it applies to real life or not. I'm just curious. I like studying the effects of that theoretically. And so I would never care about some absolute level of inflation or deflation. But the main thing is just that people are aware of the difference. If you read an article, especially like a news article, which is way more about politics than economics, you will see these three versions of inflation and deflation being conflated constantly. And you do wonder where their background was, and to be able to even write and publish that and get that approved, But I think that's all I want to talk about in this video. So hopefully that was interesting. If you have your own thoughts on the matter, do leave a comment below, and I will see you all next time.